Where is he? Where is he?
The wedding gown was already ruined by the time Janica Edaora Okoye realized her fiancé was not coming back. Not torn, not stained. Ruined the way a house is ruined by fire, long before the roof caves in. From the inside, where no one can see it happening until it's too late to stop. She stood at the altar of St. Augustine's in Victoria Island, 300 guests behind her, a bishop in front of her, and an empty space beside her, where Daniel Achebe should have been standing for the last 11 minutes. If you've ever had someone you built your whole life around simply vanish when you needed them most, you already know this story in your bones, so stay with us till the end, and if it moves you, tap like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. He stepped out to take a call. His best man kept saying, refusing to meet Janica's eyes. He'll be right back. Janica had heard those words before. 3 years of he'll be right back. 3 years of Daniel's phone lighting up at 11 p.m. with a name he always turned the screen away to hide. 3 years of telling herself that the woman calling was just a colleague, that the late nights were just work, that the tightness in her own chest whenever Jessica Nwafor's name came up was just insecurity. She had swallowed that lie so many times it had become part of her. She was not going to swallow it today. Janica turned, gathered 18,000 naira worth of French lace in both fists, and walked down the aisle alone, past her mother's stricken face, past her father's clenched jaw, past the murmuring rows of relatives who had traveled from Enugu and Onitsha for a wedding that had just become the most talked-about scandal Lagos society would chew on for months. She found Daniel in the church parking lot, in his tuxedo, phone pressed to his ear, one hand raised to silence her before she'd even spoken. Jessica's having a breakdown, he said, covering the receiver. She says if I don't come, she'll do something to herself.
20 minutes for
Baby,
3 years,
I just need
Daniel.
20 minutes. You've needed 20 minutes for 3 years, Daniel. Janica, please. Go, she said, and the calm in her own voice frightened her more than screaming would have. Go be her hero. I hope it was worth burying me for. She pulled the ring off her finger, a ring she'd made payments toward herself for 8 months because Daniel's salary at the insurance firm never quite stretched, and pressed it into his free hand. Then she walked. She didn't know how long she walked, or in what direction, only that at some point the lace at her hem had turned gray with road dust, and her feet had started bleeding inside satin shoes never meant for pavement. Lagos moved around her the way Lagos always did, Okada riders shouting, Danfo conductors hanging out of doorways, hawkers weaving between stalled cars, utterly indifferent to the bride crying silently on the median of Amadou Bello Way. That was where the car found her. A black Range Rover eased to the curb, hazards blinking. The driver's door opened first, a broad-shouldered man who moved around to the passenger side with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this every day, and unfolded a wheelchair. The man who transferred himself into it did so without asking for help, without apology, without the flicker of self-consciousness Janica half expected. He wore a plain gray shirt, no tie, no watch flashing money the way Daniel's colleagues always did. If she hadn't watched him get out of a car worth more than her father's entire compound, she would have guessed he was anybody. You're bleeding, he said, nodding at her feet.
I'm fine.
You're not,
Are
but
you
that's
okay?
not my business unless you want it to be.
Not the pitying tilt of the head she'd have gotten from someone performing concern. Just a fact, stated plainly, the way you'd tell someone their shoe was untied. I'm fine. You're not. But that's not my business, unless you want it to be. He studied her for a second. The ruined gown, the tear tracks cutting through foundation, the ring finger with its pale untanned band where a ring used to sit. Something crossed his face that might have been recognition. Not of her, of the shape of what had happened to her. There's a registry 2 streets from here, he said. I'm not asking why you're standing in the middle of Lagos in a wedding dress with no groom. I'm telling you I have somewhere to be in 40 minutes, and you look like you need somewhere to be too. So ride or no ride? Janica should have said no. Every rule her mother had ever drilled into her said no. Don't get into cars with strange men. Don't trust wealth you don't understand. Don't make decisions with a broken heart. But 3 hours earlier, she had trusted a man she'd known for 6 years, and he had left her standing at an altar for a woman who wasn't even his wife. What exactly had caution bought her? Ride, she said, and got in. His name was Ikenna Ezani. He told her that much and little else during the drive, not where the money came from, not why his legs didn't work, not why a man clearly capable of hiring a driver chose to drive himself. Janica didn't ask. She was too busy staring out the window, replaying Daniel's face when he'd said, Jessica's having a breakdown. Like it was a fact of nature, rather than a choice he was making, again, to abandon her. "You're doing the thing," Ikenna said at a red light. "What thing?"
Rehearsing the fight you should have had.
"Rehearsing the fight you should have had. I used to do it for months after my accident. Doesn't change anything. Just keeps the wound open longer." She looked at him properly for the first time. Mid-30s maybe. A face that had clearly once smiled easily and now held itself more carefully, like a man guarding something behind his eyes. There was a scar along his jaw, thin and old. "What accident?" "Car accident. 2 years ago. It took my legs and most of my family in one afternoon." He said it flatly, the way you describe weather in a country you no longer live in. You get good at surviving things people don't expect you to survive. It's not a superpower, it's just repetition. They reached the registry as the clerk was locking up for the evening. What happened next? Janica would spend the rest of her life trying to explain to people who asked, and never quite managing it, because there was no explaining it that didn't sound insane. Ikenna offered her a deal, right there on the registry steps, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man negotiating a business contract. He needed a wife. Not out of love. He was blunt about that, but because his family was circling his company like vultures, who decided his disability made him incompetent to run it, and Nigerian corporate boards, for all their modernity, still softened toward a man who had settled down. A wife would buy him credibility. Time, breathing room. In exchange, he would pay off whatever she needed paid off, give her a home, a stipend, and, this was the part that made her actually consider it, total honesty. No games, no Jessica calling at midnight, no pretending. "For how long?" she'd asked.
A year.
"A year. Renewable if it's working. Voidable if it's not." It should have sounded insane. It was insane. But Janica thought about Daniel's face at that altar. Thought about the 11 minutes she'd spent as the punchline of her own life in front of 300 people, and thought, "At least this man is telling me exactly what he wants, instead of hiding it behind a phone screen." "Okay," she said, and something in her chest, small, reckless, furious, said yes before her mind fully caught up. They were married 19 minutes later by a magistrate who clearly wanted to go home, with the registry cleaner and a security guard as witnesses. Janica Ezani Okoye became Janica Ezani in a dress meant for another man entirely, and neither she nor Ikenna smiled for the one photograph the security guard took on his cracked phone screen. The house Ikenna brought her to that night sat behind high gates in Banana Island, understated in a way that only genuinely wealthy people could afford to be. No gold fixtures, no ostentation, just clean lines and quiet expense. Janica noted it, filed it away as comfortable, and didn't think much more about it.
What did I just do?
Rich men who drove themselves and wore plain shirts weren't uncommon in Lagos. Some old money preferred to hide it. What she didn't know, what Ikenna made sure, with quiet, deliberate effort, that she didn't know, was that the company logo stitched discreetly into the breast pocket of his driver's spare uniform, the one hanging in the mudroom, belonged to Crestline Group. One of the fastest-growing conglomerates in West Africa. Fashion, logistics, real estate, media. A company whose CEO, Michael Oki, gave interviews about visionary leadership, while carefully, never naming who that vision actually belonged to. Ikenna Ezani had built Crestline from a single textile workshop in Aba, 14 years ago. He had done it before the accident that took his legs and both his parents on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, and he had kept doing it after, from behind a curtain he'd drawn so completely that most of Lagos society believed Crestline's founder was some reclusive genius who died years ago, leaving Michael Oke to run things. It was easier that way, easier than watching board members' eyes slide, during meetings, toward his wheelchair and away again, doing silent arithmetic about how much longer he'd be capable. Easier than giving his family, specifically his uncle, Chief Ikenna Ezani, and his cousin Kelechi, anything they could use. Because his family had already tried once, 2 years ago, 3 months after the crash that killed his parents, while Ikenna was still learning to transfer himself from bed to chair without help, Chief Ikenna had walked into a hospital room with a lawyer and a stack of documents declaring Ikenna medically unfit to manage his own affairs. Only a signature from Michael Oke, smuggled in during a nurse's shift change, and a furious, half-conscious Ikenna dictating a counter-affidavit from a hospital bed had stopped the takeover. Since then, Ikenna trusted almost no one. He ran an empire through Michael, lived alone, and let the world believe whatever story was most convenient. Janica, unknowingly, was about to become his most convenient story yet. And, though neither of them could have predicted it, his most dangerous secret to keep. 3 months into the marriage that both of them still privately called the arrangement, Janica sat in the reception area of Crestline Group's design division, portfolio on her knees, sweating through her blouse despite the air conditioning. She hadn't told Ikenna she was interviewing here. She hadn't told him much of anything about her days, actually. Their arrangement had settled into a strange, workable rhythm. Shared dinners where they talked about everything except themselves, separate bedrooms, a growing ease that neither of them examined too closely. He'd never asked what she did with her time. She suspected, correctly, that he preferred it that way. Fewer questions asked meant fewer questions he'd have to dodge. The Crestline job was hers within the week. Junior designer, ready-to-wear division, under a creative director named Adaize Ume, who smiled with her mouth and measured Janica with her eyes, like an appraiser pricing a stolen watch.
New money
wife.
Married some
said to
cripple
a
with
colleague in the
cash
break
and
room,
thinks that makes her a
not quietly
designer.
enough. Married some cripple with cash and thinks that makes her a designer. Janica had heard worse. She'd survived worse. She put her head down, worked twice as hard as anyone else in the department, and by month 5 had a collection of evening wear sketches that her supervisor, genuinely, not politically, called the strongest submission from the junior pool in 3 years. That was when the sabotage began in earnest. Her final sketches for the year-end showcase disappeared from the shared drive 2 days before the deadline. When she rebuilt them from memory, working through 2 sleepless nights, a nearly identical set surfaced under Adaize's name, submitted a full day earlier, time-stamped, Janica would later learn, by someone with admin access to the server clock. HR called it plagiarism. Janica called it theft. Nobody with power in the room believed the wife of a man in a wheelchair over the golden child who'd been at Crestline 5 years. She was suspended pending investigation. She went home that night and, for the first time since the wedding that wasn't, told Ikenna everything. The job she'd hidden, the accusation, the humiliation of being escorted out of a building by security while colleagues watched. She expected him to be angry that she'd lied by omission. Instead, his jaw tightened in a way she hadn't seen before, and he said, very quietly, "Which division?" "Ready to wear." "Why does that matter?" He didn't answer. He wheeled himself to his study, and for the first time in 5 months, Janica followed him, and found the door already open, an invitation she hadn't been offered before. What she saw stopped her in the doorway. Architectural renderings of the Crestline flagship store, a framed photograph of a much younger Ikenna, standing on 2 working legs, beside a sign that read Crestline Textiles, ABA, next to a woman who could only have been his mother. And on the desk, angled toward his chair, a laptop open to an internal dashboard she recognized instantly, because she'd used a lesser version of it every day for 5 months, the Crestline Executive Portal. "You're not just married to money," Ikenna said, watching her face do the arithmetic. "I built Crestline. Michael runs the public side because it's easier for the company, and safer for me, if the world thinks the founder's dead or retired. My family already tried to take it from me once, while I was too broken to fight back. I wasn't going to give them a second chance by being visible." Janica's first feeling wasn't anger. It was a strange, vertiginous grief. For the version of the last 5 months she'd thought she was living, versus the one that had actually been happening around her. "You let me get sabotaged in your own company, and said nothing? I didn't know you'd taken a job there until you just told me." "Janica, I don't watch the junior design pool. I haven't set foot in that building in 14 months. His voice, for the first time since she'd met him, cracked slightly. "But I know exactly how to find out who stole your work. Give me until morning." What Ikenna found, working through the night with Michael Oke on an encrypted call, went considerably deeper than one jealous creative director. Adaize Ume's admin credentials had been escalated 8 months earlier, around the time Janica had been hired, by a mid-level IT approval that traced back, through 3 shell layers of paperwork, to a signature belonging to Ikenna Ezani, Ikenna's cousin. The same cousin who had stood beside Chief Obiafuna 2 years ago with a lawyer and a declaration of unfitness. The same cousin who had spent the past 18 months quietly building relationships inside Crestline's mid-management under an assumed consulting title, positioning himself for exactly this moment. It wasn't really about Janica. Janica had simply become useful, a wife whose public disgrace would humiliate Ikenna by association, weaken his standing with the very board members Chief Obiafuna was courting for a family council vote to remove Ikenna as majority shareholder on grounds of incapacity. Discredit the wife, and you chip away at the husband's judgment. Do it enough times, and even loyal board members start to wonder if the man in the wheelchair still has what it takes. They've been planning this since before you married me, Ikenna told Janica the next morning, sliding a folder across the breakfast table with the same flat calm he'd used at the traffic light the day they met, though this time his hands weren't quite steady. I'm sorry. I built walls to keep them out and never thought about what would happen to someone standing beside me when they finally broke through. Janica opened the folder. Emails. Approval chains, a recorded voice memo. Illegally obtained by Michael from a contact inside the family camp of Kelechi, telling someone, once the wife's reputation is destroyed publicly, Uncle presents the incapacity petition again, this time with the board already primed to believe Ikenna's judgment is compromised. 2 moves. That's all it takes. She should have been afraid. Instead, something in her, the same reckless, furious thing that had said, yes. On the registry steps 5 months ago, sat up straight. Then let's make it 3 moves, she said, and let's make sure the third one is ours. The plan that formed over the following weeks was Janica's as much as Ikenna's, which surprised him more than he let on. She had spent 3 years watching Daniel let other people write the narrative of their relationship while he stood by silent. She was done being written about. She wanted to be in the room. She went back to Crestline, not quietly, but with Michael Aki walking beside her into HR and laying the falsified timestamp logs on the director's desk. The plagiarism case collapsed within a day. Adeze, confronted with the traced admin escalation, folded and named Kelechi as the one who'd promised her the creative director's chair at a rival Crestline subsidiary in exchange for the sabotage. That should have been enough. It wasn't. Chief Obiafuna, sensing his window closing, moved up the timeline, calling an emergency family council for the following week, inviting 3 sympathetic board members under the guise of a reconciliation dinner, where he intended to present, publicly and unopposed, a medical incapacity petition built on 2-year-old hospital records and a hired doctor's fabricated new assessment. Ikenna hadn't set foot at a family gathering since his parents' funeral. Michael urged him to send a lawyer instead and stay home. No, Ikenna said. If they want to declare me finished in front of witnesses, they can do it to my face. He didn't tell Janica the rest of what he was planning, not because he doubted her, but because for the first time in 2 years, he wanted to surprise someone with good news instead of managing bad news around them. For 14 months, in a private gym 2 floors below Crestline's headquarters that even Michael only half knew about, Ikenna had been working with a physiotherapist, smuggled in through a non-disclosure agreement thick as a Bible, rebuilding nerve pathways doctors after the crash had called permanently severed. It hadn't worked, not fully. He still needed the chair for distance and fatigue, but 3 weeks ago, gripping parallel bars until his knuckles went white, he had taken 11 unaided steps. He'd told no one. He'd been waiting for a reason worth standing up for. The dinner was held at the Ezani family estate in Ikoyi, the kind of colonial-era house with high ceilings and family portraits that made every conversation feel like it was being judged by dead relatives. Chief Obiafuna sat at the head of the table in their late father's old chair, a detail Janica noticed Ikenna clock instantly, jaw tightening, flanked by Kelechi and 2 board members who kept their eyes carefully neutral. The chief didn't waste time on pleasantries. He had the fabricated medical report read aloud by his lawyer before the appetizers were cleared. Cognitive fatigue, diminished executive function, a physician's professional opinion, paid for, though no one said it, that Ikenna Ezani was no longer fit to hold majority control of Crestline Group. This isn't about cruelty, Chief Obiafuna said, folding his hands. It's about protecting what your father built. What? We built before the accident took the version of you that could carry it. Careful, Ikenna said quietly. You're describing a man who's dead. I'm still at this table. Barely. Kelechi's smile was thin. Look at yourself, Ikenna. A wife who nearly got fired for stealing designs. A company you haven't visited in over a year. You hide behind Michael Oki because you know, somewhere in there, that we're right. Janica felt the old, familiar heat of humiliation rising. The same heat from the altar, the same public smallness. And for one terrible second, she understood exactly why Ikenna had built his walls so high. Then she stood. I didn't steal anything, she said, voice steady and set a printed copy of Adaeze's signed HR confession on the table in front of Chief Obiafuna. Your nephew Kelechi arranged for my work to be stolen and my name destroyed, specifically to weaken Ikenna's standing before tonight. It's all documented, timestamps, admin logs, a voice recording of Kelechi explaining the plan to a subordinate. Michael has copies with 3 separate law firms as of this morning, in case anyone in this room was hoping to make evidence disappear the way they made evidence appear 2 years ago in a hospital room. Silence, thick and total, dropped over the table. One of the board members actually reached for the folder. This is a fabrication, Kelechi started, but his voice had lost its certainty, and certainty was the only thing that had ever made him convincing. The doctor who wrote your medical report, Michael Oki said from the doorway, stepping in with the timing of a man who'd been listening the entire time, was paid 1.2 million naira 11 days ago from an account traceable to Chief Obiafuna. We have the transfer record. We also have the real report from Ikenna's actual treating physiotherapist, filed under privilege until tonight. He looked at Ikenna. Ikenna nodded once. What happened next, Janica would replay for the rest of her life as the single most cinematic thing she had ever witnessed, though at the time it felt too raw and too quiet to be cinematic at all. Ikenna gripped the edges of the table, his arms shook. And slowly, without help, without ceremony, without a single word of announcement, he stood. Not fully upright, not without pain that flickered visibly across his face, but standing, at his father's table, looking his uncle directly in the eye, at his own height, for the first time in 2 years. I built Crestline from one workshop in Aba, he said, and I rebuilt myself from a hospital bed you both visited exactly once. You didn't come back because watching me survive was inconvenient to your plans. I'm not the version of me you wrote off 2 years ago. I never was. You just needed me to be, so you could take what wasn't yours. Chief Obifuna's face had gone the color of old paper. One board member was already reaching for his phone, presumably to call his own lawyer and quietly extract himself from whatever legal exposure this dinner had just handed him. This family council is finished, Ikenna said, lowering himself back into the chair with the same steadiness he'd stood up with. No shame in the sitting, no shame in any of it. Kelechi, Michael's already forwarded the evidence to the police fraud unit. Expect a call. Uncle, you have 30 days to resign from every board seat you hold at Crestline before we make the medical fraud attempt public. I'm not doing this out of cruelty either. I'm doing it because you taught me, a long time ago, that family either protects you or it doesn't, and I'm done pretending you were ever the first kind. The fallout took months to fully settle. Kelechi's arrest made the business pages for a week. Chief Obiafuna resigned quietly rather than face the fraud allegation publicly, and Adaeze, in exchange for her testimony, avoided prosecution but never worked in Lagos fashion again. Crestline's board, once they understood exactly who had been running the company from behind the curtain all along, didn't demand Ikenna's retirement. They asked him to step into the light instead, to finally take the public chairmanship that had always, quietly, belonged to him. He said yes, on one condition, that the announcement include his wife, publicly, by name, with her own title. Janica became Crestline's head of the ready-to-wear design line 3 weeks later, the position earned twice over, first through the work Adaeze had tried to steal, and then through the public vindication that made it impossible for anyone to whisper otherwise again. Daniel tried to reach her once, in those months, a message that started with, "I heard about everything, are you okay?" and ended, 3 paragraphs later, with an ask for money, just until things stabilized with Jessica. Janica read it twice, felt nothing sharper than mild pity, and deleted it without replying. Some doors, once you've walked through them all the way, simply close behind you. The night everything was finally fully settled, Kelechi's case moving through the courts, the board transition complete, the last of the family portraits in the Ikoyi house quietly taken down and replaced with photographs Ikenna actually wanted to look at, Janica found her husband on the terrace of the Banana Island house, out of the chair, standing at the railing with one hand braced against it, watching the lagoon lights. "You didn't tell me you could do that," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Stand, for that long. I wasn't sure I could, until I needed to." He looked at her, and something in his face had changed in the last 6 months. The careful guardedness worn down, replaced by something that looked, for the first time, like a man who'd stopped bracing for the next betrayal. "I kept the recovery secret because I didn't want anyone's version of me to depend on my legs working again. I wanted to be worth staying for exactly as I was, first. You were, Janica said. You are. That's not a discovery I made tonight, Ikenna. I made it the day you stopped a car in the middle of Amadu Bello Way, for a stranger bleeding in a wedding dress, and told her the truth, instead of a comforting lie. That was supposed to be a business arrangement. It stopped being that, a long time ago. You know it did. He reached for her hand, not the practiced, careful movement of a man managing his balance, but simply a man reaching for his wife. And for a while, neither of them said anything at all, because some things, finally, didn't need narrating. They renewed their vows 3 months later, in the same registry where a tired magistrate had married 2 strangers in 19 minutes, except this time, the guest list ran into the hundreds, and this time, Janica wore a dress she'd designed herself. No French lace bought for another man's wedding, nothing borrowed from a life that had already tried and failed to claim her. A house, Ikenna said in his vows, standing without the chair, without an audience gasping at the novelty of it, because by then, Lagos had stopped being surprised by what Ikenna Ezani could survive, is just walls and a roof. I had one of those for 2 years, and it never once felt like anything. What you gave me, starting with a ride I offered a stranger out of pity, and ending with a wife I couldn't imagine living without, that's the thing nobody can take a board vote on. That's home, and I intend to keep it, honestly, for the rest of my life. Janica, for her part, kept her vows short. She'd learned, the hard way, that the people worth marrying were the ones who didn't need 3 paragraphs to prove they meant what they said. You told me the truth on the worst day of my life, she said, when you had every reason to just drive past. I'm going to spend the rest of mine making sure that was worth it. Outside the registry, Lagos moved exactly as it had the day they met, loud, indifferent, entirely unaware that 2 people who had once been strangers of convenience were walking out those doors as something neither of them had planned for, and both of them, in the end, couldn't imagine living without.